Welcome to the CannMed Coffee Talk podcast, where we talk with the leading minds in cannabis science, medicine, cultivation, and safety testing. I am your host, Ben Amaralt. I'm the marketing manager at Medicinal Genomics and proud member of the team that puts on the CannMed conference. Okay, you probably already know by now, but after careful evaluation of the current situation in Los Angeles County, and the restrictions and requirements that would have been necessary to hold CannMed 2021 in September, our management team has made the difficult decision to reschedule the event for May 3rd through 5th, 2022. This was not an easy decision to make. It's been almost 2 years since we had a live CannMed event, but everyone, including the conference organizers, our sponsors, and the presenters, strongly believe that in order for CannMed to be a success, it must take place in a comfortable, collaborative environment, and that's just not possible during these uncomfortable and restrictive times. So we will press on. We will continue to bring you new podcasts every other week. We will continue to interact with the CannMed community on our Facebook group, and we will continue to share all the great CannMed presentation videos that are in our free, searchable CannMed archive on all of our social media channels. You can find links to all those great resources in the show description. And also, if you have not signed up for email alerts yet, you really should. That is the best way to stay up to date with all the updates around the CannMed conference delivered right to your inbox. All right, with that news out of the way, let's get back to the podcast. Our guest this episode is Justin Bueno. Justin is the scientific director of Goodness Growth Holdings, Inc., and since joining the company in 2018, Dr. Bueno has published 2 peer-reviewed articles in the field of cannabis science. One article, published in the Journal of Cannabis Research, described the validation and the science behind the novel TerpSafe packaging system towards the preservation of terpenes in cannabis flower. That article will be the basis for his presentation at CannMed 2022, titled The Preservation and Augmentation of Terpenes in Cannabis Inflorescence. My conversation with Dr. Bueno is all about terpenes, including how terpenes contribute to cannabis effects and overall quality, why using THC potency as an indicator of quality is short-sighted, the difference between terpenes and terpenoids, how the terpene profile of cannabis flower can change over time as molecules evaporate, the inconsistency of terpene concentrations from flower to flower within the same batch, and how the new TerpSafe technology is addressing terpene preservation and batch consistency. Before we get to my conversation with Justin, I would like to thank this episode's sponsor, CannAsafe. CannAsafe is a California-based cannabis analytical testing lab paving the way in the industry through research, education, and social equity efforts, championing safe and effective cannabis, hemp, and CBD for all, one test at a time. Learn more at csalabs.com. Okay, and without any further ado, please enjoy my conversation with Justin Bueno. Good morning, Justin. Thanks for joining us on the podcast.
Hey, Ben. Thank you so much for having me.
All right. I'm excited to talk with you today about a topic that I'll admit I have a bit of a love-hate relationship with, and that's terpenes. I say that because I think terpenes are truly fascinating compounds for reasons I know that we're going to get into in this conversation. But I still feel like the average consumer out there is very unaware of terpenes. Has that been your experience as well?
Oh, absolutely. There's a focus right now in the cannabis industry to look at THC content, which is obviously critically important. But terpenes are relatively under-considered when looking at the whole phytochemical composition, especially for newer patients, as markets are continuing to open up for both medicinal and recreational applications as additional legislation is passing. There's an increase in the patient base, And to your point, with this increase in patient base, we also need to improve patient education and talk about different phytochemicals in the plant outside of cannabinoids.
Yeah, and it's interesting you say that because I just recently saw an article. I think it was on Weed Maps, and maybe I'll put a link in the show description so people can read it as well. And it was all about the author was making the case that we need to kind of break this idea that the highest potency, the highest THC cannabis flower is the best quality cannabis flower, and that that's only looking at this one cannabinoid, one specific cannabinoid, where you should really be looking at the full breadth of the other cannabinoids and of course the terpenes as well to really gauge your quality or the experience that you're having with that. So would you agree that the industry is still really kind of stuck in that THC potency number more than anything else?
Yeah, it's a great point, and you can kind of understand where this drive originates from. So, if a patient's at a dispensary looking at different label claims for cannabis flower or extract products, if they see a higher THC reported value for one product, they associate that with improved efficacy for treating their disease state. If it's looking at pain management or a variety of other conditions, you can see where they'd make the correlation with higher THC content, improved efficacy. But uh, you know, to what I talked about previously, um, the whole phytochemical composition of the plant really contributes to this efficacy across treating a variety of disease states. And when you talk about product quality, that's a really interesting attribute because, especially experienced cannabis users, when we're talking about flower specifically, really associate the aroma and flavor of cannabis with product quality. And as we can get into, we know that terpenes are the main driving force behind this characteristic aroma and flavor of cannabis flower. So, terpene content is critically important for both the perceived or actual product quality. And as research has shown, there's also interesting medicinal, recreational, and what we can talk about entourage effects um, associated with terpene content and terpene profiles.
Yeah, it's a great point. And another point that was made in this article was this idea that the chemotype information for a cannabis flower, it's all based on percent, right? So if you have a very high percentage of THC, then it makes sense to think that you're going to have a lower percentage of those terpenes. So even though you might have a high THC flower, it might be relatively lower in those beneficial terpenes for quality, aroma, or even effect.
Yeah, it's a great point. So there's a couple interesting discussion points around this question. First, um, cannabinoids and terpenes have shared biosynthetic pathways in the plant. So at some stage, there's a precursor that has to be, it can only be sent towards synthesizing a cannabinoid or synthesizing, for example, a monoterpene. So there may be
Okay.
some type of competition there where, depending upon what the plant wants to make, you may drive cannabinoid production, which would relatively reduce terpene content. So that would be one hypothesis to look at that relationship. However, kind of in my role at Goodness Growth Holdings, we do some interesting fundamental R&D on the cannabis plant. And one project we just completed was looking at different fertilization schedules and their impact on the subsequent phytochemical content of flower after harvest. And we found that, um, and it may kind of seem like common sense, the healthier the plant, the higher content of all phytochemicals you'll get in the resulting flower. So that kind of is another aspect of that relationship where you're getting different ratios of cannabinoids or terpenes, but in general, plant health overall may drive an increase in both phytochemical classes.
Yeah, well, that's really interesting. I didn't realize that cannabinoids and terpenes may share sort of a precursor molecule that is used to synthesize both. Did I understand that correct?
You are correct.
Huh.
Um, so it's a couple um, biosynthetic pathways are required to make both cannabinoids and terpenes. And one of the earlier um, reactions, the same precursor is required for both cannabinoids and terpenes.
Wow, that's really interesting. So before we move on to more of the nitty gritty sciencey stuff in terms of terpenes and kind of the organic chemistry and all those things, just before we leave behind maybe some of the folks who aren't as well versed in terpenes, I know that sometimes my mom listens to this podcast, and we would totally leave her in the dust. Is there sort of a high level or kind of cliff notes version of what people should understand about terpenes so that they can get the most out of their cannabis experience?
Sure. So terpenes are a part of a class called terpenoids, more generally, that are one of the most prominent class of plant secondary metabolites found in nature. So, what is a plant secondary metabolite? So, it's a molecule that the plant synthesizes that is not required for its day to day function or its life cycle. It's used in subsequent interactions, either in ecology and nature. Maybe it's a molecule that would attract some kind of insect that could help spread its pollen, um, or there may be other evolutionary uh, basis for wanting to produce this molecule. So terpenes or terpenoids, um, and that's an interesting thing that we probably should define. So generally, terpenoid is a molecule that contains an oxygen atom, and terpenes are within the same class but aren't oxygenated. So I'm going to use those terms interchangeably, or just simplified for this podcast, we can just call them terpenes. But that is one thing in the industry where that's another kind of definition that could confuse newer patients. Um,
And
but
and is there a difference in effect if you have one or the other, or is it just sort of
yeah,
different stages of that molecule within the life of the plant?
oh, absolutely. So over 200 different terpenes have been identified in cannabis. So when we're talking about the potential pharmacology of these molecules found in cannabis, we actually have a very broad scope of chemicals, and that results in a potentially broad pharmacology from each of these individual molecules. And some of the highlights. There's been numerous research articles you can find online about pharmacology of terpenes, but some of the highlights I like to emphasize are, they've been shown to have anti-inflammatory properties, anxiolytic, which means anti-anxiety, analgesic, and antioxidant properties, among others. And that last one I like to highlight because the fact that a terpene may have an antioxidant property, of course, when a patient consumes that terpene, it may protect tissue in the body from free radical damage, but it also may protect other phytochemicals within the plant from oxidative degradation. So,
Hmm.
for example, a really interesting application would be, what do terpenes do to preserve cannabinoid content in cannabis flower or other cannabis-based formulations?
That is interesting. But just to go back to the terpene versus terpenoids distinction, could you play that one back and maybe we can explore that a bit more?
Sure. So terpenes are part of a class, a broader class called terpenoids, um, and the accepted definition in the industry would be that a terpenoid has an oxygen atom as a part of the molecule, and terpenes are part of the same class, containing a so-called isoprene unit, um, but without that oxygen atom. So if we maybe we take one step further up the chain. Um, so terpenes are a part of a class called, if we really want to get into the
Yeah, let's do
organic or
it.
natural product chemistry, um, terpenes are a part of a class called isoprenoids. So an isoprenoid contains a specific chemical constituent called an isoprene unit. And the most prominent terpenes found in cannabis are monoterpenes, which contain 2 isoprene units, and sesquiterpenes, which contain 3 isoprene units. And we can further uh, differentiate these classes if we add an oxygen atom to them, or numerous oxygen atoms. So oxygenated monoterpenes are often referred to as monoterpenoids, and oxygenated sesquiterpenes are also often referred to as sesquiterpenoids. But I think for simplicity, you can refer to all terpenes as just a terpene.
Got it. So all the terpenes that we know and love, myrcene, limonene, beta caryophyllene, are they some kind of combination of monoterpenes, sesquiterpenes, or are they kind of all of a similar class?
Yeah, it's a great question. So each terpene is only going to belong to one terpene subclass. So, for example, myrcene is a monoterpene, beta caryophyllene is a sesquiterpene,
Interesting.
um, and those have slightly different um, physical properties based upon their differences in chemical structure. And that actually becomes important when we talk about the stability of these various terpenes in formulations or flower, and we can get into that, I think, a bit later.
Yeah, well, let's do that now because one of the things that's common amongst all the terpenes is that they're very volatile compounds, correct? And that um, they're not staying around on the flower for very, very long. That's one of the reasons why we're smelling them, right? They're continually being emitted from the flower. So I know that a lot of your research has been done on preserving the terpenes on the flower. So maybe we could talk a bit about the strategies that you have come up with.
Yeah, Ben, you're exactly right. So, like we mentioned before, terpenes are responsible for the characteristic aroma and flavor of cannabis, and this is because they're inherently volatile. So they are constantly evaporating from the cannabis plant, mixing with the air, and that provides us an opportunity to smell them because we can access they can access our olfactory receptors. So it's kind of a double-edged sword. They smell amazing because they're volatile, but since they're volatile, they're evaporating from flower, and that causes a relative reduction in concentration of terpenes in flower over time. So there are a couple parameters we should talk about with the associated with the volatility of terpenes. First and foremost, different terpenes are going to have different relative volatilities. The smaller terpenes or monoterpenes are more susceptible to loss over time as compared to the larger terpenes, sesquiterpenes. So when a patient uses flower on day one, they're going to have one terpene profile and terpene content, and that may provide them with a certain efficacy that they are looking for. Over time, that not only is that profile going to change due to loss of terpene content due to their inherent volatility, but the overall terpene content is also going to be reduced. So that's where the loss in product quality is really um, exaggerated over time due to the volatility of terpenes. And not only product quality, but potentially the efficacy of the flower may change towards treating different disease states if we're changing the terpene profile. For example, many monoterpenes are associated with analgesic properties. So if those are the terpenes that are evaporating first, you may not get that same pain relief from your cannabis flower on day, I don't know, 30 as compared to day one after purchase. So um, it's important to try to understand this from a scientific perspective about what is the rate of loss of these terpenes. And there's been some prior research done on this. So Dr. Ascioli, of course, was ahead of the game and published a paper in the 90s um, describing a 45% loss of terpene content in cannabis flower over a 1 month storage period.
Wow.
So that's a pretty quick loss. Almost half of your terpenes are gone over a 1 month, one month after purchase, pretty much of your packaged product.
Wow.
We also recently published a paper that showed a similar result. 50% of the terpene content was lost after 4 weeks of storage. And this does depend, this rate of degradation does kind of depend on a couple factors, environmental factors, including temperature, um, the terpene profile. Like I said, if it's dominated by monoterpenes, you're more susceptible to a faster reduction in terpene content, and kind of the patient's cadence of use of the product. So the fundamental reduction in terpene content from cannabis flower comes from the fact that terpenes are volatile and they evaporate from the flower and they'll fill the headspace of the packaging that the flower is in. And when a patient goes to use that flower, they open up the container and the terpenes that are in the headspace are lost in the environment.
Right.
So, how often the patient is using flower, opening and closing that container will also affect the rate of degradation.
And I would imagine the method of storage would change that too, versus if you have it in a excuse me, a plastic bag versus a glass jar or something like that.
Absolutely. So the permeability of these terpenes through different media may affect the rate of loss. Something like glass, you wouldn't expect terpenes to penetrate that medium, whereas certain plastics they may be able to penetrate over time. Um, so yes, I would agree with that assessment.
And you mentioned temperature as well, and I know that one of the old school ways of storing your cannabis was to throw it in a freezer. Is that a good strategy or no?
Yeah, I mean it depends on the application that you're looking for. When we talk about grower operators looking to obtain a product such as live resin, which would mimic the phytochemical composition of flower at the time of harvest, they do freeze that product immediately after harvest to preserve that native terpene content at the time of harvest. Um, so that temperature is a critical parameter in terpene evaporation. The hotter the temperature, the faster the terpenes will evaporate and be lost from cannabis flower.
All right. So yeah, let's talk a bit about the research that you've done and that you're going to be sharing at CannMed 2021. That's about some novel technology that you have developed to preserve and maybe even reintroduce terpenes into flower. Do I have that correct?
Yes, we're very excited at Goodness Growth about our novel patent pending TerpSafe technology. So the origin of this product was when we talked to cultivators. Um, they said that their biggest fear is losing terpene content after harvest. They can cultivate the most beautiful cannabis flower with amazing aromas and terpene profiles, but after harvest, they're susceptible to terpene loss. And of course, there are things you can do with drying and curing that kind of reduce um, terpene loss. A slower, lower dry will preserve terpenes versus a hot, quick dry. But that can only get you so far. Once it's in the final packaged product, kind of like what we were talking about before, terpenes will evaporate from the flower and be lost in the environment over time. So, with that in mind, we developed the TerpSafe technology, and the main principle behind it is um, if your patients are, or excuse me, if your listeners are familiar with the, maybe I'll take a step back, grab a drink.
Sure.
So the main principle behind the TerpSafe technology is the addition of external or exogenous terpenes to the packaging system. And we feel that this is a meaningful. We feel that this is one of the first meaningful improvements to cannabis packaging in some time. So the principle is based on Le Chatelier's principle, if your listeners remember from general chemistry. So terpenes are in an equilibrium as far as the vapor stage or the solid stage. So the solid stage terpenes are a part of the cannabis flower, and they're in equilibrium, evaporating and condensing back on that cannabis flower over time.
Hmm.
With the TerpSafe system, we're adding additional vapor phase terpenes to the cannabis packaging to drive terpenes back into that solid phase of the cannabis flower.
Hmm.
And in a peer-reviewed study, we showed that we can maintain the native terpene content of cannabis flower for up to 6 weeks. And we are continuing to research this technology, and we hope to make additional claims in the future about longer storage durations. So not only does this maintain the product quality as far as the flavor and aroma of cannabis flower longer, it should also provide a more reliable efficacy from dose to dose for cannabis patients, as we are providing a more reliable terpene profile and content independent upon many factors that can cause variability in those two parameters.
So, if I understand correctly, then the package itself is containing terpenes that aid in sort of keeping the terpenes in the solid stage so that they stay on the flower. So, do you have to have the same terpene profile in the package to match what the flower has?
Yeah, that's a great question. So again, it depends on what application you're looking at. So one of the basic applications for this technology is to obtain a terpene extract that mimics the profile of your cannabis flower, and
Hmm.
that will preserve that terpene profile longer as compared to a sample without TerpSafe or a control. Another application that we're looking at developing is tuning the terpene profile
Hmm.
to achieve um, specific concentrations of various terpenes for targeted disease states. And this would coincide with additional research around terpene pharmacology, but we're really excited about that aspect from a medicinal, or that application from a medicinal aspect.
Yeah. So, in that case, could you take sort of a flower that's where a lot of the terpene content has been evaporated off and then sort of put it into this packaging and reintroduce some terpenes into it?
Yeah, that's a great question. And that's one of the experiments we report in the peer reviewed paper. We rejuvenate cannabis flower that was relatively depleted of terpene content. So I think the flower had about 0.1% terpenes, so almost non-existent. Typically flower available for consumption has about 1 to 3% terpene content. So we're an order of magnitude below that. And using TerpSafe, we reinvigorated or rejuvenated that terpene content upwards of 1%. So now we're achieving a terpene content suitable for pulmonary delivery.
Excellent. And now, is there sort of a limit to the amount of terpenes that you can reintroduce into a flower? Like, is there just so much that it will take on?
Yes, and you can tune uh, that value by the amount of external terpenes added to the TerpSafe system.
Hmm.
So we found a linear relationship between the amount of external terpenes introduced and the resulting terpene content of the flower. So this would provide grower processors with a application to obtain cannabis flower with a specific terpene content, based upon market and patient needs.
Excellent. And so now, what is the size of this packaging? Is this more for wholesale large batches, or is this even down to like the individual packaging that a consumer would take home?
Yeah, that's a great question. So we have launched TerpSafe nationally through licensing our patent to e-bottles, and we can get into that in a little bit. But basically, the TerpSafe system can be used at any scale, packaging size, independent on flower amount. But for our initial launch, we have an all-in-one system where the TerpSafe component is integrated directly into the cap of the cannabis packaging jar. So I think the initial system is for 3.5 grams of cannabis flower, or an eighth, a pretty common amount in the industry.
Mhm.
But future iterations, it will be independent upon size. Um, Simply for larger batches, uh, for a grower processor who wants to preserve terpene content prior to packaging that material, you can just add a couple of these TerpSafe components to larger amounts, and you get that same preservation that a patient will experience in their 3.5 gram container.
Excellent. And now, how many different terpenes are you able to use in this system? I know we mentioned that there are over 200. How many different ones are you able to reintroduce or preserve?
So we found in our initial study that the system was effective independent upon terpene utilized.
Hmm.
Now, the rate of preservation or infusion may vary based upon terpene utilized. We found that the monoterpenes are more volatile, so they offer a higher infusion rate as compared to sesquiterpenes. But in principle, any terpene can be utilized in this system. That includes terpenes derived from botanical non cannabis sources. Terpenes extracted from cannabis plants can be reintroduced to get that strain specific terpene profile preservation. And even synthetic terpenes could be utilized if the appropriate safety considerations are adhered to.
Wow. Well, that's really fascinating. And before I know we're kind of wrapping up here, but I did want to touch on just the difficulty of actually measuring terpenes. I know that's something that's come up in conversations that I've had with others who are kind of in the analytical space or the testing space. How difficult is it to test for terpenes specifically within the cannabis matrix? Is that one of the reasons why maybe not a lot of labs are testing for it, and why when we go to the dispensary we don't always see terpene content on packaging?
Yeah, as with any botanically derived samples, there's going to be inherent heterogeneity. So there's going to be variability across
Mm.
cannabis flower, um, even from the same location on the cannabis plant. And like I mentioned earlier in the talk, there are numerous sources that can cause variability in terpene profile and terpene content. And these include cultivation and grow practices, how you're curing and drying your flower, genetic, um, and numerous other factors. So, because of this, there is an inherent heterogeneity of the sample that can definitely
Mm.
cause difficulties providing an accurate and precise terpene content when tested. Um, Another thing is that terpene analysis is expensive. If a grow processor wants to do it in house, the equipment is quite expensive. The Headspace GCMS is not cheap, and you need someone with some sort of experience or skill to operate it. On the other hand, I've found as we do terpene analysis in house that has supported some of this research we discussed today. Um, there's over 200 terpenes that have been identified in cannabis flower, but when you're analyzing for terpene content, you're not going to quantitate all 200 of those. So there's going to be a lot of potentially interfering compounds. They're quite similar as far as Many of them are isomers of one another. Um, so my point is that terpene analysis takes a lot of time to get an accurate and um, to interpret the data to get an accurate and precise result. So for a third-party testing lab that has to pay an analyst to do this, there's definitely um, a labor component that is represented in what the charge for that analysis is going to be. So a grower processor really has to weigh if they want to spend that amount of money to determine terpene content, um, even though most new patients are not familiar with what a terpene even is. So is there any added value there? So I
Right.
think the USP Cannabis Expert Panel recommends the quantitation of 5 terpenes for all cannabis flower products. But I don't think the industry has caught up to that yet. And frankly, 5 is probably too minimal. 20 or more, maybe a little bit more appropriate. But with further patient education and maturity of the industry, hopefully we can improve this, and that may result in improved outcomes for patients if they have more information to make their decisions on what cannabis product to buy.
Absolutely. And it's a great point you make about sort of the heterogeneity of the plants themselves, that if you take one bud from one section of the plant and compare it to another, they could have different concentrations of these terpenes. And then if you layer in the other variables of time, how long has it been since that sample was analyzed until it gets to you, and could the chemotype have changed between then and now? So it does make sense that your solution here is going to create a much more consistent product, so that people can get some more reliable results.
Yeah, Ben, you described one of our main applications for TerpSafe, which is a more reliable terpene profile and terpene content across the entire batch of cannabis flower. And we envision batch to batch reproducibility. As you know, different harvests, if plants are grown in the winter versus the summer, may have different terpene profiles. If they're exposed to different amount of light, they'll have different terpene profiles. So all of these are factors that we can reduce their impact on the variability of terpene profile of cannabis flower using the TerpSafe technology.
All right, excellent. So winding down here, I did want to give you an opportunity to share any additional information that you think the listeners might be interested in. That could be a website, social media accounts, or some of the studies that you may have mentioned. I'll jot down the notes and be sure to put them in the show description so people can learn more.
Yeah, I appreciate that, Ben. So our peer-reviewed paper talking about the science, proof of concept, and validation studies of TerpSafe was published in the Journal of Cannabis Research. So you can find our paper there. Our website is terpsafe.com. That is TerpSafe.com. And there is an email, contact us there. So please feel free to reach out with any questions. And that brand is available nationally through our partner eBottles, and our in-house TerpSafe brand, known as Amplify, is available at Goodness Growth Holdings dispensaries in Maryland and Arizona, and those dispensaries would be Green Goods dispensaries.
All right, excellent. Thanks again, Justin, for coming on and talking terpenes with us. And I look forward to seeing you out in Pasadena for CannMed.
Hey, thanks, Ben. Appreciate it.
All right. I hope you enjoyed my conversation with Justin Bueno. Check out the links in the show description to learn more about the topics we discussed. And thanks again to this episode's sponsor, CannaSafe. Our next episode drops September 15th. That's 2 weeks from today. In the meantime, please do check out the CannMed archive and join the CannMed community Facebook group to stay connected with us. Of course, you can also stay in touch with us on social media, Facebook, Instagram, LinkedIn, and Twitter. Just look for CannMed events. Also, sign up for their email alerts on CannMedEvents.com, and be sure to rate, review, and subscribe on your favorite podcast app. I do sincerely hope to see all of you out in Pasadena this spring, but until then, stay safe, stay healthy, and join us on the next CannMed Coffee Talk.